Many of you will know, Mwangi, or T as he's known, and you might know him as the kind of preacher guy who comes and preaches, but that's just a side hustle, right? That's not your main gig. Other than supporting a very average football team, what is it you spend your time doing, bro? Are you allowed to say that? I think, yeah.
Cool. So I work for an organization called Resource Global. And what we do is we equip, mentor, train Christian professionals. And by professional, I mean any form of work, what you were describing, vocation, to figure out how to integrate their faith into their work, how to merge the two, and with an attempt to raise a generation of Christians who are changing and transforming our cities and nations through our work. Yeah.
Because I hear, and I say it, this is the thing, one of the things I say, and I kind of sometimes think, what am I saying? There's a lot of language in church about how, we're created in God's image, we're created to do good works and for a purpose. But at the same time, there's kind of this background narrative, which is, but the only place to express this is on our children's rota, or if you volunteer within church ministry. And sometimes I feel like the only legitimate way to serve God is if we're in church ministry, but I don't think this is what it's about, right? There's something much more profound going on. What do you think this is?
I think it's sad that we have relegated our view of what serving God to be only within the church. Not because serving God within the church is bad, but it's because, on average, most of us are going to spend 90,000 plus hours. In fact, in Nairobi, it's more like 100,000 plus hours of your adult life working.
Wow.
You only spend 2 hours a week in church.
Most of these guys not even that. Let me tell you.
So for God to have created a space that you're going to have 90,000 plus contact hours, and the only sort of value we see in it is in its attempt to help us pay bills or build our name, but that it has no value for God, I think is completely warped.
There's this weird disconnect, isn't there, between kind of, this is seen as the sacred space, and that's seen as the secular space. Why do you talk a bit more about that?
I think it's interesting because the whole concept of sacred-secular divide didn't always exist. Like, you look at the Bible, and the Bible has no distinctions between sacred and secular. You don't see distinctions between your spiritual life and your life, or work life, or home life. It's just life. Yeah. But over time, and you can sort of kind of trace it in church history, we began creating this divide where we elevated roles within the church space, or what we call ministry in quotes. But it's not true. Bible just has life. And it's meant to be one life lived through God. And work is such a key component of that life. And so that's why we need to figure out how does my life and God come together.
Yeah. I was with someone recently, we were talking about their role, and they said, because of kind of the company that I run, we indirectly employ upwards of 30,000 people across East Africa. And the way in which we operate dictates kind of how these people are cared for and loved and treated. And he said, I see this as my primary way of showing people Jesus, yet the church makes me feel guilty because I don't make coffee.
I mean, you think about it, and we have traditionally, within the church space, equipped people to go out and share the gospel. But what we do is we equip them for a week of going out to share the gospel, right? And so we send everyone out, and we go out into the street, and we find people to share the gospel. And that's amazing. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. That's not a bad thing. But we do that, and we feel good that we did a week of missions, or we went out somewhere into a place and did missions. But then you don't think about the 10, 500, 30,000 colleagues who you were in meetings with for hours, whom you were in spaces with, whom you could have loved on, cared for, engaged in such intriguing intellectual work conversations that are transformative to the point that you begin to shine a light for Christ in that kind of space.
And missions becomes this kind of event, doesn't it? It's like, oh, we're going to stop working now so we can go on missions. Like, what does that mean? And I think as we look to kind of, there's a narrative to be regained here, right?
There is. I think we need to just, it's, a large part of it is a shift in mindset, to realize that God created a world that operates with work, that at its core, work is at the basis of a lot of how the world runs, right? He says he feeds the birds, but he doesn't throw the worms into the nest. The bird needs to go out and get a worm. And if it does, God will provide a worm for the bird. Same thing with us, is he has created a world where work is core to our provision, but is also God's way of him touching the world. It's almost like we become God's, through our work, God's hands and feet, you know. If our guard today does his job really well and watches over a home, the people in that home probably prayed at night, God keep us safe. And God, through the work of that guard, gave his providence to that home. And the moment we begin changing our mindset to realize in whatever form of work we engage in, we are God's hand and feet, then we begin changing our mindset towards even the jobs we kind of don't like.
All right. And because I think in that, it's really interesting, a lot of this conversation is often around, oh, so you lead this like multinational company, that's amazing, do it for Jesus. But like the vast majority of us sat here going, okay, so like I stack shelves in a store, or I do some menial tasks which I don't particularly enjoy, or like, you know, I was thinking about the vocation of my hands yesterday, like changing dirty nappies and stuff like that. Okay, what does all this conversation about work and faith mean in the kind of maybe the more mundane stuff, the everyday?
I think one is seeing ourselves as God's hands and feet. But secondly, it's a realization that what you had mentioned earlier, because we are created in the image of God, work then becomes worship. It doesn't matter the type of work. The work becoming worship is not qualified by the type of work. It is qualified in us working. And in any form of engagement we do to yield any form of productivity, then we are worshiping God. It's interesting that the root word for work, as you were saying, is the same root word we find for worship. And so the moment we are following the very purpose for which we were created in the image of a God who worked, and are engaging in work as he did, then we are engaging in worship. And so worship is not the 20 minutes that Chikwaza leads us when we're here.
As beautiful as that is.
As beautiful as that is. When you're crunching numbers on your Excel sheet, it should be as beautiful as when we were being led in worship.
We talk a lot about discipleship with Monday in mind. And that idea, you know, historically the church kind of did this for a long time, but in recent times we've kind of done discipleship with Sunday in mind. That we're kind of growing people to be good in this space on a Sunday. But actually our formation and growing to be more like Jesus is meant to shape our Mondays as much as our Sundays. But can we just get practical? What do you think kind of discipleship with Monday in mind? If I'm going to grow towards Jesus with Monday in mind, what does that look like?
I think, so before I got into what I'm doing now, I worked within the church space and pastoring for a couple of years. And I mean, we were always in a space where we're being reminded the role of the pastor is to equip the saints for works of service. Right? And so even in our discipling, it was with that in mind, to keep the saints for works of service. But I found myself at a point looking back and realizing I was equipping them for works of serving the church, not service to God in totality. Now, that's not bad, because as they serve in the church, they are serving God. But that's not works of service. I think discipleship with Monday in mind means, how do we equip a believer to have a clear theology, a clear relationship practically with God, that then impacts every kind of engagement they will have even outside the church space. I have always enjoyed working with younger men, and there were a couple who I was working with within the church, a couple of young men. And the day I sort of had to stop on my trucks is when I realized I was kind of like preparing them as they grew more committed into their faith towards choosing to become pastors. Now, not because that was bad, but because I sat back and I was like, these guys are so immensely gifted. Some in teaching, some in IT, some in engineering, and they have all this talent, and I want to tell them, pack that, and now because you are so committed to God, get into the church space. And I had to completely change what I believed discipleship means.
I mean, I wish someone had said that to me when I was growing up, because I would have been a professional footballer. And I think you're right. This sense of like, the only way you can really serve Jesus as you go forward is to be some. And it's not that there's anything wrong with these kind of things. I think we just think the more committed we get to Jesus, the more it pulls us away from what we're meant to do, rather than giving a different vision for what we might do in that space.
And I think a part of it is something you always talk about, the complete picture of the gospel, right? So because we often don't remember that we are saved from sin, but into a restorative mandate, then we miss out on seeing why discipleship with Monday in mind is a big deal. Because what greater space is there to engage with the mandate you've been given to participate in the restoration of God's world than through our work?
We're going to carry on talking just for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So I'm going to ask, there's just a couple of guys who are going to walk down, and you can give them your questions if you want. They're going to bring them up here. I recognize there's going to be way more that we can deal with today than we want to do. So I think, Mwangi, was something we were going to do previously, but why do we say we'll do this? We can run some workshop just to address some of the stuff that come out of this. So we've done it a couple of times in different formats where we've gathered people around digging deep on this. What does it mean to kind of do work the way of Jesus? And we want to dig more into this. You talked a little bit about your story, but what about, just for a moment, what about those people who feel conflicted about wanting to serve God and not knowing what that looks like in their space?
I think sometimes there's several things that cripple us as Christians, right? So one is a view that now if I'm going to integrate my faith and my work, then I need to find a job that, for lack of a better word, is God has called me to, I'm passionate about, I feel this great sense of, and that's amazing, but not everyone will get that job. Genesis 1 and 2 paints a perfect picture of work, but Genesis 3 also reminds us that there is a broken element to the world we live in, and work is part of what is also broken. And so many of us will end up in jobs because we need to meet our daily needs. But the amazing thing is, any job we end up in can then become calling depending on the mindset we have. If we realize that it is God who's opened that door, and therefore if I am in that space, I am responding to God opening that door for me, then it becomes calling. And it starts giving us an excitement to figure out, how can I serve God in that space? I think the bigger question is not what jobs do we land in, but in whichever jobs we land in, how do I serve God in that space? I think the biggest question is what you do there, not primarily where, unless there's a specific call God is putting on you.
I want to take some of these questions. Mwangi, there's some really tricky ones which I'm going to give to you, and then I'll take some of the easier ones. That's what it means to be in charge. I think this one is one that comes out kind of time and time again. I think it's a really interesting one. What about if the stuff that we are currently involved in, or would like to be involved in, or isn't, kind of goes against Christian principles as a work? And like one of the examples here is potentially being a soldier, but feeling like Jesus wasn't into fighting. By the way, this is not a political debate. Just before you guys get excited, we're not going there today. That's another story.
Okay. Two things. One, I think there are spaces that your convictions wouldn't allow you to get into, right? Because the Bible is very clear on some spaces. So, like if you were to tell me you want to be a hired hitman, I would struggle because the Bible is very clear on murder. So I think there are some that are very simple. But then there are others that are, and allow me to use this word, but culturally difficult, because in different contexts we view them as within a Christian morality lens, spaces we can or cannot get into. So in some spaces, they'll be like, oh, you work for a betting company and you're a Christian? How dare you? But my response to a lot of those is, we still desperately need Christians in all these spaces to transform them for God. Because who else is going to protect the laws, the regulations, the policies in these places so that they don't go haywire? Who else is going to keep them in check? And there are amazing stories of such people who have been able to do that. If your conviction is really struggling, then don't get into it. I mean, I think it's completely difficult to do work normally. Now, to do it with a guilty conscience each day is just too hard. So if your conviction is struggling with a particular space, don't get into it. But if you believe God is opening a space for you to go, first, be clear on what God wants you to go do there. Find people to keep you accountable to what God is calling you to go do there, and go there and transform that space for God.
Yeah. I want to read out this. I'm a bit worried this might be someone from my team, but I'm going to read it anyway. How do you cope with a person at work who intentionally annoys you? Is that you, Adrian? Have you written that about me? No. What? I'm joking. How do we deal with kind of some of these like really down to earth, like difficult spaces that we might be in? Yeah.
One of the funnest responses I've ever had is a friend of mine who their belief is I pray them out. I pray for my boss to get a promotion in one of the biggest multinationals and leave, you know.
So guys, if I leave next week, you know, right?
But honestly, I don't know whether there is one answer. And this is why integration of faith and work is not an event. It's how you live your life, and you need to be walking with God. In some spaces, God just needs to build your character through that boss. I'm sorry for you if that's your space. In some spaces, God needs you to reach that boss. In some spaces, God needs you to fight for people whose culture and whose behavior is wrong, and stand up against injustice and oppression. And so the answers would look very different. It's hard to give one answer. Yeah. I think the main answer is you just really need to, if you're going to integrate your faith and work, you need to walk with God, because it's going to get hard.
And you know, I think it's really interesting as well, just on top of that, is I think when we shift our view of work being about us and church being about God, when we start seeing work being about God, it helps. It certainly helps me as I've done a bunch of different careers here. I'm not doing this for me.
Yep.
Like, they can be annoying to me, but this is Jesus' space. Yep. And I think that's really important, just as we keep our eyes on that. One thing I heard, my friend recently found his job space just really kind of anti his faith. So he decided, I'm going to take a monastic approach. And in the monasteries, they have kind of a call to prayer several times throughout the day where the bell rings. He said, so I just set this little reminder on my phone. It goes off 2 or 3 times during the day, and just reminds me to take a couple of minutes out and say, God, I am here for your service. I'm here for what you want to do. I'm often blind to it. I'm often kind of overwhelmed by all that's going on. But I'm just going to take a moment out of my day just to invite you back in, Lord. Will you be in that space? I think there's this next question really interesting. It's I think it taps into a bit of our psyche in Nairobi around money. And some of you know where we're going with this. And a kind of lots of side hustles and different things. It's easy to kind of worship money when we've divorced it from God. But as we bring this to the table, like, kind of what do you think God is saying about kind of wealth and money and the amount of work we do and jobs, and you know, does Kenya's habit of side hustle complicate ideas of life and faith?
I mean, first and foremost, I think it is, if you look at Kenya's culture of side hustle outside of a context of realizing how difficult the economy and life is on most people, then you can easily look down on it. But for many people, it's not out of, I just love never sleeping.
Yeah.
It's just...
I love 17 jobs. It's amazing.
It's just, life is difficult, and it's the brokenness in work. And I think there's several ways to look at it. One is for those of us who are in spaces to affect employment, job creation, wealth creation. We can be part of this.
We've got to stand up, right, to this.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can be part of those people who pay people well so they don't have to have 15 jobs just to put food on the table. We can be part of those people who are such good entrepreneurs that we're creating jobs. But yes, you are right. There are other people who have just worshipped a sense of, I'm always busy, I'm always working. You know, you ask them, how are you doing? Oh, yeah, the hustle, the grind. And they don't really need to. It's just it's a culture that seems to be worshipped and exalted. I would just remind them, we work like God, and God didn't need to rest, but he rested. And being able to rest and be still and have healthy work-rest rhythms allows for worship of God, but allows for trust in God, also for provision and for growth of our businesses and work. And so there is need for a balance through all those things.
I hear this a number of times. People go kind of, this is the thing that I feel like I'm meant to do. Or this is the thing I'm really passionate about, but I don't get paid for it. Or I want to get paid. What does that look like? How do we, the things we're passionate about, you said it earlier, that there's some things we just do just to put food on the table, right? And for myself, like the things that I love uniquely that no one's ever going to pay me to do, football being one of them, I kind of turn my hands to in different ways. But what about those people who are kind of like, I feel this is what I'm meant to do, but it's not what I do?
Again, I don't think there will be one. So one approach is, if you genuinely are burdened about it, and then perhaps God is calling you to a journey of faith to step into those spaces and trust him for provision as you pursue the things you passionately love and are gifted in. Part of it is the realization that we can be multifaceted in life.
Yeah.
And all of those things can still be work being done as unto God, and in spaces that we can still engage with God in ministry. It doesn't have to be, if I choose this, I can never do this other one.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I love doing, you've seen, I love writing children's books with my kids. And I'm never going to make a career from that, but I carve out intentional time to pursue things that, whilst they might not put food on the table, bring joy to my family and to my friends and to other things. I think those things are important, like kind of dedicating time to them. So similarly, someone said this: would it still be fine to develop your talent even though it's not in line with Christianity? And I think we've had quite a narrow definition of what Christian skills are. I love the fact the first person in the Bible that's filled with the Holy Spirit, hey buddy, was an artist. And that is God's kind of gift to us. And I think of Eric Liddell, kind of the runner, who's like, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. That kind of thing. Cheers, Johnny.
I agree with you. I think the problem is we view that there are Christian talents and non-Christian talents. There's nothing like that, especially if we believe God is the talent giver, then there's nothing like that. I think the issue is develop your talent, and how can you use it in a way that God will be glorified. I don't even necessarily mean, because often when we say that, we believe, okay, if I play guitar, that means I must play guitar with Chukwaza at the front for God to be glorified through my guitar playing. That's not what I mean. It's in whatever spaces God will open for you to live out your talent, how can you be clear on how you are glorifying God through it and reaching people through your talent.
This one I love, and I think it's really important. We need to kind of, we'll land this in a couple of minutes. I think it's really key to get into. We talked about kind of made in God's image as this JD, which is kind of very crisp, out there, useless, not practical talk. How do we ground this in really practical ways? Because my worry as we go into the workplace is that the extent of our vision of Christianity is, can I drag someone along to Alpha? Or can I convert someone over the coffee machine? As though that might be the extent of God's glory in the workplace. But kind of as we look at this JD of being made in God's image, what's that look like for us as we kind of, tomorrow morning, what does it look like?
The way I help my mind process this is I say work, we like saying work as unto God, and that is one element, but work like God. And God was so kind that the first passage in Genesis gives us a detailed account of how he worked. And there's several things. One, God didn't allow any day for him to do work and that the work was not good. He looked back, he's like, I've done good work today. Christians are, unfortunately, being associated with mediocre work. And I think that's one of the ways in which, when you talk about working in God's image, is that we cannot be producing mediocre work. You always talk about the fact that when you're looking for a dentist, you don't look for a Christian dentist, you look for a good dentist. It's not like you go with the toothache and you're like, oh, do you know John 3:16? No, you just need the toothache. But Christians, I dream for the days when a HR practitioner sees a CV and can tell this is a Christian. They're like, yes, we finally got a skilled worker in our company. But nowadays it's like, oh, they'll be missing work going for prayer meetings, kind of thing. And so excellence is one thing, and God modeled that for us. Second is creativity. God, I always say it's fun how he made so many variants of every living thing, animals, plants. I mean, he could have just done basic design for birds. And they're all gray with wings, and it works, and they all fly.
So glad you weren't in charge.
But he didn't end at just, I have made birds. He made hundreds of species of birds that all have unique elements to them. And that's immensely creative. It's sad that we've left creatives to mean you're an artist or musician or something. We all need to challenge ourselves if we are working in the image of God. Creativity needs to be a big part of it. The best example I give for this is Joseph. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream, but doesn't end there. He gives a creative solution to the problem that he's telling Pharaoh is going to come. Pharaoh asked him to interpret my dream. He didn't say, give me a solution. But he exercises creativity and gives a solution that saves a region from famine. We need to challenge ourselves in our work, as we work, how are we creatively responding to the practical problems in our organizations, in our cities, in our worlds? How can we be part of the solution? By challenging ourselves like God does by engaging in work creatively.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I found is like, where are the opportunities to invite God into this journey? I have a very different job to many of you, and I get to, and it's often there are ways into Christianity through the daily work, but there are times when that isn't. And I think there's moments where I go, do you know what, God, this doesn't feel like a moment where I can be telling someone that Jesus loves them, but it does feel like a moment I can just quietly pray to you and ask you to be with me. And just on that, because I caught Vera's eye just then, Vera modeled something to me, get to know her if you don't know her. She just bakes and cooks for people all the time. And these people, if you turn up to her house, bring a box because you're going back with stuff. But she was just telling me, this person doesn't know Jesus, but I just hang out with them, and when I do, I go and take food for them and stuff. There's this old lady who lives across, she doesn't know Jesus, but I just take her flowers sometimes. So I think it's those kind of things, like in the vocation of our hands, kind of like, do we look different to the world around us by the way we operate? Guys, just one thing as I was praying this morning, we're going to wrap up now. I want us to do this. I'm going to invite our kind of team to come forward and be part of this. I recognize some of you go into really tough places to work. Some of you go into really hostile environments, maybe not like openly hostile, but places where like, I don't know what it means to be a lawyer and worship Jesus. That sounds like an oxymoron. Or like, I'm in the banking sector. This is really tricky. Or maybe, sorry, I didn't mean to offend anyone. We love lawyers. We employ plenty of them here. Or maybe you're teaching in a place that just doesn't feel like Jesus is around, or the spaces you work feel very removed from Jesus. I think we need to pray over these areas as well.
Or even if it has nothing to do with the environment, but your own inner battle with joy in your work, with fulfillment in what you're doing, with finding a bigger sense of purpose in what you're doing.
So guys, this is what it means to be family. We're just gonna pray for one another as we wrap up. So guys, can you all stand with me? Cheers to you. If that's you and you feel like that, whether you are like, guys, whatever you feel, if you feel like you're struggling in the workplace to know what any of this means, do you just want to put your hand up or put your hands out in front of you or whatever? And by the way, I'm expecting at least a third of us on this, not to put any pressure on us. I just know what it's like. Like, I feel this in my own life. If this is you, just put your arms out in front of you, and we're just going to gather around you wherever you are. Guys, there's people in here. Let's just gather around them. If they're next to you, just start praying for them. Brenda down here, guys, can we just get around them? Wherever people are, if you're going, I don't know what it means to use my talent for the way of Jesus. If there are people around you, they've got their arms out, just as we are wrapping up, can we just pray for them? Lord God, we just thank you for the way in which you've created us to be vibrant, to be different, to be uniquely called and skilled. Would you reveal to us the way in which you want us to work for you? Lord, for the single mom trying to balance everything, for the dad who feels like he is never home, to the person who goes into a hostile environment, to those faced with corrupt decisions, to those whose boss is just vile to them. And Lord, to all the other scenarios that we're just wrestling with, would you give us your eyes? Would you give us your hands? Would you give us your heart, Lord, as we pour ourselves out into our workspace? And Lord, for those of us who are embarking on something new, or that we're about to embark on something new, or feel like maybe we should, Lord, we just want to raise them up to you. Lord, would you give them your eyes for this next step? Would you give them your faith for this next step? Would you fill them with all that you are for this moment and this season? Guys, we're going to sing just as we wrap up. Thanks for indulging us and leaning into this conversation. Thanks so much, T. Appreciate all you had to say today. Guys, we recognize that there's a bigger conversation to be had here around this, and we will continue just to find ways to talk about this. And sorry for those questions that we didn't answer. It wasn't because they weren't valuable at all. But guys, bless you. Have an awesome week. Get to know some people. Grab some coffee. Get to know us. Talk to us. And let's sing. Thanks, Chikwaza.